This lecture is on Thomas Aquinas, sometimes called the dumb ox. Mythos and Logos. Why dumb ox? Well, Thomas Aquinas often would sit in class and never say a word, and his professors often thought he was simply dumb. A big man, hardly spoke, and they thought perhaps he was not at all attentive or alert to the lectures. But in fact, Thomas Aquinas, as a young man, was intensely attentive to the lectures, the readings. He was a voracious reader, but he was so busy absorbing some of the important lectures in the 13th century that, and they were being processed at a very significant level, that in time he became the most significant philosopher, theologian of his time, and he went on to be seen as the philosophical doctor, theologian of the Catholic Church as well. So it often seems to be someone who is not listening, is not attentive. In fact, they can sometimes be the ones who are internalizing the more important issues in a much more sophisticated way. But let me backtrack a little bit before I look at the Logos, Mythos tradition, because there's often ways of doing philosophy and theology and politics that it's very abstract, it's very rational, it's very logical, but there's also a whole tradition as well as mythos and storytelling. And so I want to touch a little bit on that as I reflect on two ways of knowing in the Middle Ages of Western civilization. So it's easy to jump from an Augustine to an Aquinas, and we're looking at abstract arguments, reading abstract articles, following arguments, premise, conclusion, or major, minor, premise, conclusion. And we begin to think meaningful philosophy is just about logos, or a certain understanding of logos. The language of logos can be interpreted in many ways, but one way it has been interpreted is logical reasoning and people abstractly thinking, and that's the mark of an educated human being, if one can follow an abstract argument step by step to some significant conclusion that is supposed to, in principle, prove a point. And so logos, in that sense, is defined in a very narrow way, that it was never understood by the pre-Socratic philosophers, by Plato, by the book of John, fourth book of the Gospels, and through significant elements of the Christian philosophical theological tradition. And this is what has led to the rebellion amongst the, say, late modern, postmodern thinkers against what they call logocentrism that has to be opposed. And what they're critiquing is a caricature of logos itself. But often when the meaning of a word shrinks, then inevitably you get a reaction, legitimately so, to its abuse or misuse. So logos and mythos. But let me travel back a few centuries to elements again of the Christian tradition. Touched a little bit on Augustine, traversed some of the terrain, but I'd like to land lightly and quickly on the monastic tradition within Christianity and the vision that it had for politics and justice and the common good. Underneath the monastic tradition, which was solidified in Benedict's rule, and his sister Scholastica, she started her own order. So brother and sister were very central in this, and they were drawing from much older tradition of John Cassian's conferences, Pachomius's work, Anthony the Great. There's a whole tradition back of Benedict and Scholastica as two leading people in shaping elements of Christian thought as lived. So what's central here? Well, one of the big questions anyone has to ask beyond just theory and thinking about what is reality or the ultimate good or what it looks like in penultimate journey is how are we to live together, or how are we to live, or how do we shape our own lives so we live life in a meaningful way? Well, the monastic tradition took the position that, first of all, drawing from Aristotle and others, as well as obviously the Christian tradition itself, is that we are the most alive when we recognize we are social beings. We are meant for one another. We're meant to support one another, to kindly challenge one another when perhaps we're being indulgent, or we're being egocentric or narcissistic. And the retreat of the individual into isolation leads to a very unhealthy journey, and it can spiral downwards into depression. And so Benedict and Scholastica were at the forefront of articulating what is the nature of a meaningful, a genuine, an authentic human life, and how is that to be lived? Well, their view was it was to be lived communally. People were to share possessions, share property. They were to live close to nature. It was a tradition of the contemplative as embodied in a supportive community in which possessions were shared, in which a liturgical round, not just of the divine offices, but the purpose of the 7 divine offices in a monastic life is to slow people down. It's to reflect on how have I lived this morning in thought, word, and deed. And so the stopping every few hours to reflect on one's inner life and how it's shaping itself in relationships with other people. And so the monastic tradition was meant to be an ethos which was created by which women and men would live communally together in an environmentally, ecologically sensitive context. And you could even go across the river here up to Seminary of Christ the King. It's on a hill as well. So this is where you get very much the mountain valley metaphor. Is what's the relationship of going up to clarity of insight in the context of community, then coming down into the valley of communal life, and then what is the relationship of that to public and just life. And so the monastic tradition as embodied in Benedict and Scholastica was very much an attempt to understand how are the best of ideas to be lived out in an area of human community, simple living, and then near to nature itself, so one does not take advantage of nature, abuse nature, but there's a symbiotic relationship between God, humans, and nature in this triangle of life, or the 3 sort of legs on the chair that holds the chair of social thought up in a meaningful way. And so the communal life, it's obviously you don't exploit one another. Humans engaged with nature, you don't exploit nature because of the symbiotic relationship one has with it. And what's the relationship of those two with an understanding of the contemplative, or one's experienced life in God? So the Benedictine tradition was really much an idealized view of the new Christian life and how it was to be lived, certainly drawn from sections of Acts and the Pentecost, where people shared all they have. Interestingly enough, Karl Marx was very drawn. He saw the monastic life as proto-communism, and in some of his key works, he's very critical of Henry VIII and the destruction of the monasteries, for he saw in the monasteries a form of early Marxism in which people lived communally, shared possessions, were in tune with nature. Obviously, the element of the divine was not exactly front and center for Marx, but the more vertical, a horizontal dimension was front and center for Marx, and the monastic tradition was key there. Now, as any institution unfolds, inevitably there's going to be deformations, there's going to be distortions. Because of the Benedictine tradition became the dominant form of thought, work, and life in the West, it did prosper, and the many Benedictine monasteries became actually very wealthy. The danger of the monastic life, and this would be the downside, it is a retreat from the world. It's a retreat from the hurly-burly of life, from the public square, from politics, from serious engagements with issues of injustice and war and things like this. Now, it would not be totally true to say that monks were disengaged from that historically. In fact, the Benedictines were very engaged in these issues in a whole variety of ways in terms of the relationship of monastic tradition, with dioceses to bishops to public issues to ruling and all of these issues. But what inevitably happens is, as I mentioned, any institution over time can become distorted, corrupted, and that doesn't mean one dismisses the institution. Abuse does not prohibit use. Or if a garden gets weeds in it, you don't destroy the garden, the best flowers, you weed the garden. And so there were constant reform movements within the Benedictine monastic tradition. But by the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, there were criticisms of monasticism. And as a result of these traditions, a whole movement emerged in the Roman Catholic tradition called the Friars. The Friars were quite different than the monks, and two orders emerged at this period of time, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Friars were not as committed to a place, i.e. a monastery, and their life was much more given to engaging in an explicit way the world they lived in. Of these two traditions, the Franciscans, or Francis, and again, a woman he dearly loved, Clare, were a key element. And again, you can see the Franciscans coming out of the Benedictine tradition in terms of their view of nature, their view of living simply. So you get this tradition in the Franciscans, and also close to nature itself. So the great poetry of Francis, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. You get the Franciscan tradition being one in which you don't have to live in a monastery far from the cities or the towns, but in fact friars can live in the midst of these realities. And so in Francis you get very much, and Clare, they form two orders, the Franciscans and the Poor Clares, which continue to exist today. And again, you have women and men leading together the future reforming movements within the life of Western civilization. And so in Francis you get this living very simply. Relationship to nature is very symbiotic, as in the Benedictine tradition, and very poetic. So you get this literary tradition in the Franciscan. His close friend was Leo, and of course Leo is always a symbol of the lion, in which how are our inordinate, our addictive passions, our swollen appetites, how are they to be tamed so that we don't become victims of unhealthy desires and longings that only hurt us and other people in the long run. So his close friend is Leo, is obviously the one who has gone into those deep places in his life, faced the shadows, the drivenness, the addictions of his life, and he has overcome them. And so Francis, Leo, Clare, they are key figures in terms of the emergence of the friars. Now the other order which emerged was the Dominicans. Now, Dominic founded the Dominicans. Often the Franciscans and Dominicans are contrasted by the Franciscans are very much people of the heart. They're people of passion. They're people of feeling. They live, they're not particularly interested in sophisticated philosophical arguments or following logical argument for one place to the next. They're much more interested in the friendships between people and cultivating community and living in harmony with nature. The Dominicans were very much, of which Dominic forms, and this is where I come to Thomas Aquinas, because he was a Dominican. Thomas was born in 1225 and died in 1274, so a fairly short life. Aquinas essentially had his BA, MA, and PhD studies done by the time he was 22. He was obviously, but they wouldn't give him formally his PhD because he was much too young. And within the Middle Ages, the argument was one can have all the philosophical, theological, intellectual, political ideas well in place and properly organized in the house of one's soul, but that doesn't mean the character has been properly formed. And so knowledge is one thing, wisdom and soul formation is quite another. So Aquinas topped his class again and again in his abilities to absorb, to think, to write. But the people who, as it were, his spiritual directors, or his abbas in that sense, basically argued, give yourself 10 years and see how your character responds to the challenges, the difficult issues in life, and how are processed. Because one, of course, can articulate and know these things, but still not have dealt with them internally in the imagination, the soul, the spirit, or the body. And so Aquinas, for really almost 10 years before he was awarded a PhD, had to live into what he knew cognitive but had not internalized in terms of the formation of his character. And so this again is an older notion of education that Aquinas understood. Now anyone who's studied Aquinas, and we'll be looking at some of his works in the class this week, cannot help but be taken by, here is someone who thinks very rigorously and vigorously in a logical manner. He had absorbed the writings. A lot of the writings of Aristotle had come through translations by Muslims. They had done very, very good work, as well as obviously the Latin tradition itself. It wasn't as if somehow it was just the Muslims had brought the richness of classical Greek thought to medieval Europe. In fact, there was the rich Western tradition of that also. That had been, one of the things of monasteries, one calling is constantly be transcribing manuscripts, and these are inevitably passed on. And Thomas Aquinas and the Dominicans inherited this, great scholars, philosophers, theologians, the Dominicans. There often seems the intellectual class, as the Franciscans are the class in Christianity of the heart and the feeling, and both of course are part of what it means to be human. But Aquinas had inherited an Aristotelian way of knowing it, and perhaps he pushed Aristotle much further than Aristotle would ever go in terms of feeling absolutely obliged to frame and articulate arguments in a logical fashion so there could be no doubting the validity of a conclusion, and hence the reality and richness and motherlode of the Christian tradition to think in this way about the hard, difficult issues of God, the nature of God, the relationship of God and Christ and the incarnation, what that means for the church, what it means for politics, what it means for justice, what it means for peacemaking, all of these issues. So Aquinas's writings are very much engaging and encountering all these large and substantive issues that greeted his time in the 13th century. And so we get in Aquinas this attempt to articulate quite a vision. Dante, if one wants to get a sense of the poetic version of what Aquinas is doing, Dante's Divine Comedy, and his many other writings for that sense, are very much the poetic, the mythos. In that sense, Dante is the mythos of which Aquinas is the logos. And there are two visions and ways of interpreting this rich tradition itself that has been inherited from the classical ethos. And so Dante and Aquinas, for different reasons, embody the mythos and logos. And hopefully anyone who finishes their BA, if they haven't read Dante, Divine Comedy, and its other ways, one will miss that whole poetic literary tradition of which Aquinas embodies the logos, or a certain understanding of the logos heritage itself. So in Thomas Aquinas, then, we get a thinker at the very apex of Aristotelian logic. And as I mentioned earlier, much of Aristotle's writing is not done in that obviously he does a book on logic, but even the way Plato and Aristotle articulate their visions of the ultimate, the penultimate, literature, poetry, it's not done in premise, conclusion way of thinking. So and out of Aquinas's works, then, interesting enough, by the end of Aquinas's life, he became acutely aware that all he had produced, all he had birthed, still did not touch the depths of his experience. And he had a very profound, intense experience near the end of his life, by which he said, everything I have written is but straw in comparison to the intensity of the light which has come to bear in my inner life and illuminated my soul in a way that all these writings do not do, because they're about reality, they are not reality itself. And so even in Aquinas, you get this sense of so much of his life was dedicated to a certain read of reason or rationalism, which would be different from logos in that sense, and perhaps we need to distinguish the two, but also the depth of experience, which was pure gold for Aquinas, which in that sense linked him to the Franciscans in many sense. Now what flowed from Aquinas, of course, of which to some degree I suspect he would have been more hesitant to follow, but which his writings laid the groundwork for, was late medieval scholasticism as a way of knowing in which to be an authentic, a mature, a genuine Christian was to think as Thomas had thought, to articulate how Thomas had, and if a person could not follow logical arguments from premise to conclusion, then picking up another argument, and it had to make sense. And of course a person can more or less in their thinking seemingly be making sense in the world, and yet still their own soul and spirit is in a state of chaos and confusion, and hence you even get Pascal arguing later that the heart has reason for which reason knows nothing. And so deeper than the cognitive organizing, sifting, dissecting mind is also greater depths to what it means to be human. But late medieval scholasticism moved in a very rational, cognitive way, and it began increasingly so to lose the role in that sense of the heart of imagination. And this is where the mythos side is very important to understand in terms of ways of knowing stories that are told, narrative. And myths are not falsehoods, they're just eternal truths wrapped in the garment of a story. So I mentioned Dante earlier, and the journey in Divine Comedy and what Dante does, he draws from the wealth of the classical tradition in terms of what's the nature of going deep into the shadow, the dark places of the soul. That's the inferno, which we live with complex desires which butt horns with one another, and who is the self in the midst of the internal confusions and the shadows that are at work, and the many voices internally, and what part of a person should one listen to and why. And a person can go in their own journey into the inferno. So reading Dante's Divine Comedy is really a story of various women and men who go to various rungs, as it were, or layers in the inferno, and he names people, and he names tendencies within the human soul towards passivity, towards anger, towards bitterness, towards cynicism, towards skepticism, to those people who only want to talk all the time but never do anything in their life, paralyzed, impotent people, and the inferno that leads to, and they know they're not living a life in a full, meaningful, genuine, and authentic direction. So the inferno. The next step, of course, is the Purgatorio. So each person has to ask, what has to be purged in me on my journey? What are those things I cling to which imprison me in a cage? And who are the women and men who have had those struggles with them but worked through them? Those have been purged, and this is what we call the Purgatorio. And so the journey from the inferno, where one knows something is not right, can name what is not right, and then the purging of those issues through women and men who are spiritual mothers and fathers, Alma and Abbas in this classical tradition, or mentors, assists in the purging. And as one is willing and has the courage to work through those deep inner issues that people may not want to, that they cling to, they get attached to, then one enters the Paradiso. So the three levels of the human journey. And of course much psychology and today has picked up on a great deal of those depths, the subconscious, the unconscious levels of reality that go much deeper than Aquinas's pure reason. But in fact, there's layers upon layers of people, and their own souls are often a blend of inferno, purgatorio, paradisio, and how does one navigate those waters in terms of the ocean of the soul at its many, many different levels. And so Dante, in that sense, is the great mythic psychologist of Christian tradition, in which these layers and levels, and it's never a case of, well, now I'm out of the inferno, I've entered the Purgatorio. We constantly live at these levels all the time, and so reading this great trilogy of Dante is a journey into the inner life. And then, of course, Dante wrote about politics as well, and what that means in the public domain, as faith is meant to engage the public area. So mythos, particularly as articulated by Dante, offers an alternate way of knowing and being to a certain Dominican Thomist way of rational scholasticism. And so these two need to be held together, Dante and Aquinas. I just want to finish with two more mythos stories, and then I'll conclude this lecture in terms of the late Middle Ages Christian tradition. One is the Arthurian tradition, which of course was about the just society. The other I'd like to briefly mention, the Nibelungenlied, which is the European tradition. These two myths or stories are obviously not about rational arguments. They're about journeys into the soul, and people who either go there or who don't go there, and what the journey looks like. And so again, mythos versus a form of logos or rationalism is a way of knowing. Within the Nibelungenlied story, you have Siegfried, who very young is caught in a situation of war. His parents are killed. He flees. So you have someone at double level. You have a family. He's an orphan. Very, very early, Siegfried, he's an orphan. He does not know his parents, and as a result, he does not know his history. He's spirited away very, very quickly by his parents, who are both killed in the process by raiding opponents, and he's brought up as an orphan by someone who is very much on the edge of the political world at the time. And so Siegfried does not know his nature. He doesn't know who he's meant to be in one level, and he's raised in seclusion, but raised in a way in which the person who adopts him cares for him, mentors him, shapes him, and he essentially is one who just makes horseshoes for horses, and he beats these things into shape. And so in that sense, he seems to be at one level a laborer, but as a result of growing up this way, he learns to be with the common people. He learns what it means to be just part of the lowest, what would be the lowest class. And so Siegfried, as he emerges, though, he comes to see very clearly that his life is to be one as his adopted father dies. So he's an orphan. He has no family. And so the sadness of this growing, where do I belong? Who am I? As Siegfried's life unfolds, he comes to see through others contacting him that he comes from a family, but he needs his memory restored. Okay, and so you have this notion of, it's almost the Platonic one of the Meno, or more popular, Total Recall, is that deep within us is a story yet to be told, and yet do we know that particular story? And so Siegfried's story is one of, I'm going to have to move a little fast forward on this, to prove who he is, and in all myths there is the challenge, there's the struggle, there's the agon. He goes deep into the cave, okay, this is Plato's cave really, and to save a civilization, he has to battle the dragon who constantly threatens and kills these particular people. So he goes into the cave, and of course the dragon who sits on the gold is the classic one. You get this in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Smaug, who sits on the gold. He does battle with the dragon, and so here you have the challenge. No one could defeat the dragon. Siegfried defeats the dragon. And in that sense, he doesn't retreat from the big challenges in life that can move him the next step into his self-understanding. He defeats the dragon, but in defeating the dragon, he bathes in the dragon's blood, and he doesn't get, the blood will protect him from ever being killed again, but there's a spot of him that doesn't get the blood on it, and it becomes his weakness. or what we would call in Greek thought the Achilles heel. So everyone in this story, the myth, what is your Achilles heel? What is the weakness within a temperament that, if not dealt with, can lead to a tragic end, and eventually that plays itself out. Now, there is the ring in the cave, and the Nibelungen keep telling Siegfried, don't take the ring, because it's a ring of power. Siegfried will not listen to the Nibelungs, and he takes the ring, and rather than listening, and this is where the weakness, Siegfried does not listen when wise people come to him and explain to him, you have giftedness, you have a rich future, but if you don't deal with the shadow, the dark side, that's going to have serious implications. And again, Siegfried, at crossroads points in his life, even though he's highly gifted, he has a tragic flaw in his personality, which then leads to his end at the end. And if I had time, I'd explore more of these. But the myth of the Nibelungen is really a story of character formation. And when people don't want to face those issues in terms of Dante's Inferno, what do they become? And if they don't enter the Purgatorio, of which those places are purged, or at least faced. The same thing with the Arthurian tradition. Arthur, again, is born to rule, and the myth of the Arthurian tradition is very, very much one. Again, I don't have time to go into it. It comes from southwest England, actually, where I grew up, is that whole Arthurian tradition in Merlin's cave. I might also add that the Nibelungen, as in Arthur, you have the wise woman, the wise person, Merlin. You have the wise Amas, which in this goes is just an old monastical mythic tradition. There are always wise women and men on the journey who've been through their own inferno, their own purgatorio, and then they emerge wise people or sages or wizards in that sense. So you get, for example, Lord of the Rings, you have Gandalf, but you have the opposite to him is Sauron. Doesn't have the character, but he has the power. Gandalf has the power and the character. You get in Harry Potter the same, Dumbledore, and then you get Voldemort. Power without wisdom, wisdom and power. You get in the Star Wars, you get the Jedi. Luke Skywalker has the potential to be wise, but for a variety of, again, issues he has not dealt with, or he has dealt with inappropriate, the tragedy of him, or the Sith, for example, power without wisdom. And so in the Arthurian tradition, you get Arthur and very few people through sheer strength, and this is of course with the Arthurian tradition again, it's not through pure strength, it's through what is a person's calling. Only this person can call the sword out of the rock. And in that sense, the Arthurian tradition is about each person, and it's not through strength, it's through the nature they have been given. They are given a sword to pull out from the rock. And every person's vocation is about finding the sword, their Excalibur, they are called to pull out, so that then they can enter the fray of their own life through community, and then through public responsibility in forming in the Arthurian circle the just kingdom. Just one more point and then I'll end this. After Arthur and Galahad and Lancelot defeat those which would destroy what was to become Logres and the Arthurian kingdom, what happens is they're the victors. But Arthur himself becomes too preoccupied with his work, with his ruling, and he's not there for his wife, Guinevere. And inevitably, when the husband's away all the time, you have, in this case, a lonely wife. And out of this becomes the relationship between Guinevere and Lancelot. And so very much the myth of relationships, in terms of often when people start a relationship, it can begin under a blue sky and rich and lovely, but if people are not attentive to one another, or men get too busy in their efforts and they're not there to meaningfully engage a growing relationship, things can start going askew. And of course, the tragedy of the Arthurian tradition is the tragedy of broken relationships, and then the whole faltering of that kingdom as a result of that. What seemed to be two very close friends at one point fragment over infidelity and adultery, and then the Arthurian tradition unfolds. So within the, and there's so much more that I could say about the Nibelungen. It's a great epic. as is the Arthurian tradition, so much to it. But it's the mythos tradition of character formation and wisdom and insight, which must always be seen as running alongside of the rational tradition of argument and thinking, of which in some ways Thomas Aquinas reached the very apex. But the irony is that Thomas also knew at the end of his life that there was more to being human than being able to articulate very succinct and brilliant arguments. And so in some, mythos and logos, two ways of knowing, a literary, a poetic way that probes the souls, the journey deep down and then ever up, that takes people from the inner life into the public and political realm. It's neither either or, and then an approach also to the role of rationalism, which in some means, as I mentioned earlier, demeans the deeper meaning of logos as a philosophical term. But that rationalist way of thinking will then move us very much into the rise of science in the 16th century, and the Dominicans, for Aquinas and then the Dominicans, begins to merge hands with the rise of a culture of empiricism, induction, deduction as the main means and method of defining what is legitimate to know, what's going to take front stage, and how that way of knowing becomes imperialistic and colonizes other forms of knowing. But that then moves us into post-late medieval ages scholasticism, into the fragment which is going to begin in the 16th century, which Erasmus himself will be responding to.